From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The House January 6th committee votes to subpoena former President Trump as the Biden administration extends the COVID public health emergency, and listeners write in on topics far and wide. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Kim Strassel and Alicia Finley. Happy Friday to you both. On Thursday afternoon, the House January 6th committee held what could be its final public hearing with a few pieces of new evidence, but also much replaying of testimony already heard. The hearing ended, though, with a 9-0 vote to subpoena testimony from former President Trump. And here's how Congresswoman Liz Cheney of Wyoming justified that extraordinary step.
Our committee now has sufficient information to answer many of the critical questions posed by Congress at the outset. We have sufficient information to consider criminal referrals for multiple individuals and to recommend a range of legislative proposals to guard against another January 6th. But a key task remains. We must seek the testimony under oath of January 6th central player. More than 30 witnesses in our investigation have invoked their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and several of those did so specifically in response to questions about their dealings with Donald Trump.
Kim, what do you make of this subpoena from the committee?
I think the chances of this happening are low. Now, Donald Trump came out and said, I can't wait to do this and sign me up. That seemed like a Trumpian reaction. We'll see if his lawyers, after they have some conversations with him, actually advocate if that's a good idea, assuming that he chooses not to or the decision is that he's not to. I think it would be very hard to make this happen prior to the elections, at which point there's a very high prospect that Republicans take over and that they would end all of this. And so, Donald Trump essentially has to hold out for a couple of months, come up with excuses, reasons he doesn't want to do this, and then it's not likely to happen. For that reason, although I would say for some other reasons in my judgment, I think this was a poor idea. This is an unprecedented step, Congress demanding a former president appear in front of it. They can justify and argue that, it's necessary, but as with many things the January 6th committee has done that are unprecedented, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of thought about the precedent that this is setting or any of the bigger issues involved here that go beyond Donald Trump and that day. And so I kind of wished they hadn't done it.
And to the point that Liz Cheney was making, it's true that a lot of the people that the committee has questions about did take their Fifth Amendment rights. So that includes John Eastman, who was advising the president that Vice President Mike Pence could throw out electors or maybe send the joint session into recess so that the states could recount or whatever they intended to do. It also includes Jeffrey Clark, the Justice Department official, who was trying to internally pressure the Justice Department to put out some letter giving credence to the fraud claims made by President Trump. You'd also put in maybe that category Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, who's refused to testify. Steve Bannon has refused to testify, has been convicted of contempt of Congress, and will soon be sentenced for that. And then even people who did testify, so White House counsel Pat Cipollone I'd put in this category. He gave his impressions of what was happening in the building. He gave his own thoughts, but he wouldn't talk about the conversations that he specifically had with the president. And understandably so, I think there's a question of executive privilege here. There's questions of what precedent you want to set. Is every White House counsel after the president leaves office going to be asked to come up on Capitol Hill and explain everything the president ever said in that person's presence? I don't think that's a good precedent that we want to set here. So, Alicia, the other thing, though, is that I think this was always going to be the case. Those challenges were always going to be there, and yet I do think that the committee has already done a pretty good job of pulling into the public domain a lot of testimony that does shed light on what President Trump was doing in the lead up to January 6th, and then even on that day.
Right, and I would just go back and just clarify. With the case of Mark Meadows, he claimed the executive privilege when he refused to testify. He actually provided a lot of documents to the committee, but just refused to go before the committee and testify. And I think to the extent that you brought up executive privilege, Justice Kavanaugh actually wrote an opinion that, there are serious constitutional issues in making someone who is a close advisor to a president, like Mark Meadows was, testify. And when you raise the question of, whether to actually make a former president testify. Those are even bigger constitutional issues that the Supreme Court hasn't addressed. And I think it actually wants to dodge this question to the extent that it can. And I kind of agree that if the GOP takes control of Congress or the House in November, this is going to be a moot point. But if Democrats somehow manage to retain control of the House, this will be litigated and could go up to the Supreme Court. And I think the Democrats would lose the case. Now, back to your other question, we already have learned a lot through the January 6th Commission hearings. We've seen how, Donald Trump was basically just watching all this unfold on TV, didn't do anything about it, and actually was laughing and thought it was funny. I mean, we know this. We're not going to gain any new information. Perhaps what they really are trying to find is, the mens rea, the state of mind, and trying to back up their contention that he should be indicted for quote-unquote obstruction of justice or obstruction of Congress and fraud. The idea that being that by obstructing an act of Congress or official proceeding that this commits fraud against the U.S. And so I think that's what they're really trying to get at. Not really more new information, but trying to bolster their accusation that he knew about this, that he knew was going on and was willfully basically engaging in conduct that was criminal.
But to that point, I guess my argument here is that I think the January 6th committee has already accomplished some of that. We have seen the videos of Attorney General Bill Barr saying that he told the president that these fraud claims were baloney, video of top Department of Justice officials saying the same, video of a lawyer with the Trump campaign saying that they weren't finding anything that would change the results of the 2020 election, and they told the president that. We have video of descriptions of what was happening on January 6th. So the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said that there were not calls from the White House. There were calls from the vice president who seemed to be giving very explicit, very direct, unambiguous orders, was the quote from Mark Milley. And then another piece of video, this was one that caught my eye on Thursday, was the question to Pat Cipollone. And the question is, when you were in the dining room of the White House, in these discussions with the president, was the violence at the Capitol visible on the screen, on the television? And Pat Cipollone replied, yes. And so I think we have a lot of evidence of what was going on, Kim, and I grant that it would be a media spectacle to have President Trump trudge up to Capitol Hill and sit in front of Congress. But I guess I don't know. Do they expect him to do the thing at the end of the James Bond film where the bad guy fesses up and explains his whole plan all along? Wouldn't President Trump take the Fifth Amendment himself or be combative and try to argue that the 2020 election really was fraudulent? I guess I don't understand what they expect to get from him.
That's the other problem with this subpoena, is that they're not going to get anything from him. And if they think that if he's going to acknowledge any of the arguments that they make or apologize. Come on, they know better. And I know we're not supposed to ever question the motives of the January 6th committee, but, it's very hard to look at this, their decision to here again hold another hearing a couple of weeks before the election, issue this dramatic subpoena, and not believe that this isn't at least in part a political calculation. Democrats want Donald Trump to be front and center of this election. They think it works to their advantage. It's certainly something to be talking about rather than the mess that is the economy that the White House and Democrats in Congress have fed into with all of their spending, inflation, gas prices, what's happening overseas, their Iran deal. So far better to talk about Donald Trump. Here we are doing it too. And I just find it hard to believe that that isn't really the goal here, rather than any kind of naive thought that Donald Trump is going to add to the body of knowledge that they already have.
Perhaps to answer my own question somewhat, here's some of the reaction from President Trump on Truth Social. He says, "Why didn't the unselect committee ask me to testify months ago? Why did they wait until the very end, the final moments of their last meeting? Because the committee is a total bust." And then he added, "The unselect committee knowingly failed to examine the massive voter fraud which took place during the 2020 presidential election, the reason for what took place on January 6th. So I expect if he did come up to the Hill to the committee, that is, we would get more of that same. And Alicia, the other open question I think in my mind is it seems like the committee knows its work is wrapping up, that Republicans are likely to take the House and shut the committee down in January. But there were some mentions made of a final report that they are writing that will be coming here. And one thing that I'm wondering is how much new information it will include. And will it include full transcripts of a lot of the testimony that the committee has taken? I mean, I think it's been a problem for the committee's credibility, certainly on the right side of the aisle, that there's been no full transcripts released, that there's been no cross-examination of the witnesses allowed because there are no opposing Republicans who are sitting on the committee. But at least for posterity, Alicia, it seems to me that the public deserves to know the full transcript of what a guy like Pat Cipollone said.
I think that's right. I think Republicans, who knows, maybe they could subpoena them when they gain control of Congress, to the extent that, recall that Democrats tried to subpoena several House members. Maybe they will return the favor and try to subpoena these transcripts, because I highly doubt, to your point, that they will actually include them in this final report. They want to create the narrative, set the narrative, and that's what they've been doing throughout these hearings, essentially in show trials, that Donald Trump was complicit with the January 6th riots. And I don't think they're going to allow for a full airing of all the evidence or anything that could somewhat undermine their account of this. They want to set the narrative, and providing all the transcripts, even in some kind of an appendix. I don't think they want the public or anyone to go over that and to actually have another look and be able to make up their own minds about what actually happened.